This is our tutorial video on the Iconic Instruments' first ever drum synth series, which includes a full explanation of how to use the iconic Syndrum, the DS-4, and the synth versions of both the Syndrum and the DS-4. In the description of this video, you will see a table of contents with hyperlinked time markers. So if you want to jump ahead to a specific topic, just click on the blue hyperlinked minute and second marker next to the topic you want to learn about, and the video will jump ahead. The instruments in the first ever drum synth series are made for use with Kontakt and will work either with the full version of Kontakt or the free Kontakt player. Presumably you already have Kontakt installed and have it running in your DAW. If not, please check out our primer video on Kontakt. The Syndrum and the DS-4 are modeled after the original units, which are both 4-channel drum synths. These 4 keys control channels 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you can trigger each channel with your controller board, with Kontakt's Virtual Keys panel, which you can activate or deactivate from the pull-down menu from this options icon, or with MIDI directly within your DAW. There are 3 sections in both the Syndrum and the DS-4, the velocity section, the channels section, channels 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the effects section. The layout and function of the velocity and effects sections are exactly the same on both instruments, but there are some minor differences in the channels section that reflect the functionality of the original units. Let's first focus on the velocity section. Velocity just means how hard you strike the note. So if the instrument is set up to respond to velocity information, it will respond differently as you hit the key harder. This velocity section controls how velocities affect volume, so the harder you hit the key, the louder the note will play. In some instruments, velocity can be set up to change pitch or filter cutoff or even trigger different samples altogether. The Syndrum and DS-4 have a separate velocity pitch control in the channels section, but we'll go into that later when we talk about the channels section. The velocity section just controls how the velocity affects volume. At the bottom of this section is the velocity on-off switch. So when this switch is off, there is no velocity sensitivity, meaning that the note is triggered at full volume no matter how hard or light you strike the key. When the velocity switch is set to on, it turns on velocity sensitivity in one of 2 modes. At the top of the velocity column, you can switch between velocity mod and velocity curve. When it's set to curve, as you sweep the knob, the velocity curve sweeps between a curve with an increasing slope, where only the hardest key strikes trigger a jump in volume, and a curve with a decreasing slope, where as you increase the velocity, it increases the volume sooner. The velocity mod setting simply affects the instrument's responsiveness to velocity information altogether. When the amount is set to low, spun to the left, the changing velocity has no impact on the volume and triggers a full volume sound. As you increase the amount, the impact of the velocity on the instrument increases. The 4 knobs give you individual control over each channel. So for example, you might want a bass drum type of sound to be less velocity sensitive and a snare type sound to be more dynamic. And again, the velocity section for both the Syndrum and the DS-4 are exactly the same. The second section of these instruments is the channels section. The controls for the Syndrum and DS-4 are different from each other as they are in the original units. But in each instrument, channels 1 through 4 are identical. So we'll just go over the controls for one channel in each instrument. So let's start with the Syndrum. Each channel has a noise component and a tone component. Starting with the noise, the leftmost switch toggles from turning the noise off to volume level 1 and the louder level 2. And the fader sets the noise decay. Aside from the channel output level, those are the only controls in the channel that affect the noise component. Everything else in the channel section affects the tone component. Let's just turn the noise off at first to demonstrate how to control the tone. Firstly, the tone sustain fader changes the decay time of the tone. On the right side of the channel section is where you can select the waveform and pitch. This three-way toggle sets whether you are triggering a sine wave, which has less overtones and a more round tone, a triangle wave, which has more overtone emphasis and a brighter tone, or a square wave, which has the greatest overtone emphasis and the brightest timbre. The coarse fader, second from the right, sets the pitch in half-step intervals, and the Syndrum has an 8-octave range. The far right fine fader sets the tuning in cents, or 1/100th of a half step. There are 3 control effects for the tone component in the channel section: the velocity pitch control, the sweep, and the vibrato. With the velocity pitch section, as you increase the fader, the velocity increasingly affects the pitch of the note. So the harder you hit the key, the higher the pitch moves. And conversely, the lighter you hit the note, the closer it stays to the pitch set by the coarse and fine faders. The next section with the 2 yellow faders is the vibrato section. The vibrato is just an LFO, or low frequency oscillator, that controls pitch. The 3-way switch changes the shape of the LFO between sawtooth, triangle, and square waveforms. The rate fader controls the speed or frequency of the LFO, and the spread controls the depth of the waveform. The vibrato section is pretty wild, and it's one of the outstanding features of these drum machines. You can set the rate and spread to the point where the LFO actually starts to self-oscillate, and you can get some pretty complex tones when you push it to extremes. And finally, the sweep section connects the volume envelope to a pitch control. So as the volume decays, it also bends the pitch up or down by the amount set by the fader. If it's a short decay, it will bend quickly, but if it's a long decay, it will bend the amount set by the fader over a longer course. You can have all 3 effects in play at once and get some really unique textures. The output knob in the upper left corner of the channel sets the overall volume of that channel. By default, the output of each channel goes to Kontact's main output, but there's a pull-down menu in the output section that allows you to assign it to different outputs within Kontact. Just note that the effects section of these instruments only applies to the main output, so if you send a channel to an output other than the default output, the effects section won't be heard on that channel. We'll get into more detail on channel routing in our video on Kontact. Let's look at the channel section on the DS-4. One thing I have to point out is that, like the Syndrum, each channel has a noise component and a tone component. But something unique to the DS-4 is that each channel's noise is different from the others. So the noise in channel 1 is called cymbal. The noise in channel 2 is also called cymbal, but it is a different noise sound from channel 1. The noise in channel 3 is called snare, and channel 4's noise is actually called noise. And it's the only way in which the DS-4's channels are not identical. In each channel on the DS-4, you can choose between noise and tone. You can't blend noise and tone in the same channel the way you can in the Syndrum. If you really want to trigger both noise and tone from the same key, you can set up 2 instances of the DS-4 at the same time and set both of them to the same MIDI input. We'll go into that more when we talk about multi-instruments in the presets section of this video. So let's start very simply with the decay control. Whether you have the channel set for noise or one of the tone settings, the decay fader controls the length of the note. This is the V.C.O, or voltage controlled oscillator section. This 3-way toggle switches between the noise and 2 different tone waveforms, sine and square waves. So as we talked about in the Syndrum description, the sine wave, in theory, produces no overtones. In reality, these vintage synths don't create perfect waveforms, which is part of the vibe that people like about vintage gear. The sine wave in the DS4 is actually a little more like a triangle wave, so it's a little richer and more colorful than a pure sine wave. The square wave is expectedly more overtone rich, which gives it a brighter, more strident tone. Similar to the Syndrum, the noise is not affected by anything other than the decay control and of course the channel's volume control, but in the DS4 the attack knob also affects the noise. But if we switch to the sine or square wave, we have all the other controls at our disposal. With the V.C.O section, we can switch between half steps using the tuning knob at the top. And choose which octave from the octave slider switch at the bottom. The velocity pitch fader behaves exactly the same way as the velocity pitch fader in the Syndrum. So when you push up this fader, the harder you hit the key, the more the note pitches up. Next, the attack knob, which is unique to the DS4, increases the volume of the first 15 milliseconds or so. The result is that it adds a sort of hardness to the attack of the note. If you push it very far, it can overdrive the attack a bit, which can work for your mix depending on the track. Like the Syndrum, the DS4's LFO is pretty extreme, and it's one of the really unique features of these instruments. You can toggle between a sine wave and a square wave for the LFO. The amount knob sets the depth of the LFO, and the frequency slider sets the rate. Just as in the Syndrum, you can push the amount and frequency to the point where the LFO starts to self-oscillate and create really unique complex tones. The bend section connects the decay envelope to pitch control. This toggle determines whether it bends up or down, and the fader sets the amount of the bend. The speed of the bend is directly related to the decay. So the bend travels the same amount whether the note is long or short. And finally, the output knob controls the volume of that channel. Just as in the Syndrum, the output also has a pull-down menu so that you can assign the output to different outputs within Kontakt. Just note that the effects section of these instruments only applies to the main output, so if you send a channel to an output other than the default output, the effects section won't be heard on that channel. Like the velocity section, the effects section on the Syndrum and DS4 are identical to each other. There's the effects on-off switch at the bottom of the section, and the effects are applied evenly across all channels. There are 3 effects: distortion, delay, and reverb. The knob sets the amount of the effect, and the pull-down menu sets the type. Within the distortion, you can choose from crush, which is a bit crusher, crunch, which is along the lines of a guitar pedal distortion, tape, which is an emulation of tape saturation, and comp, which is a compressor. The delay options are meant to sync with the tempo of your track. You can choose from whole notes all the way up to 256th notes, with dotted and triplet options in between. Typically, you would use quarter, eighth, or 16th note settings for a kind of conventional delay sound, but it's worth experimenting with some of the much faster delay settings like 1/32 and above. And finally, the reverb comes loaded with 4 original impulse responses: room, hall, plate, and spring. Since we sampled every waveform at every pitch on both the Syndrum and the DS-4, we've spun off our own original synthesizer versions of these two instruments, with the notes laid across the keys chromatically and with synthesizer-specific functionality. In terms of their functionality, the Syndrum Synth and the DS-4 synth are identical, except for the waveforms in the V.C.O, or voltage-controlled oscillator. The difference is that the Syndrum has 3 different waveforms: sine, triangle, and square waves, and the DS-4 only has 2, sine and square. We did install a 3-way toggle in the DS-4 though, and the middle position generates a square wave and simultaneously the same note as a sine wave an octave below. When this switch is set to poly, the instrument is polyphonic, meaning you can play multiple notes at the same time. And mono and legato modes are both monophonic or single-voiced. We'll talk later about how the ADSR controls relate to the mode when we talk about the V.C.A and V.C.F modules. But there is more than just the number of voices that differentiates these modes. The glide knob is a portamento control, so as you increase the glide, the more the pitch slides between notes. This works in poly, mono, and legato modes. And the velocity sensitivity knob sets how much velocity affects volume. This is just like the velocity amount control in the Syndrum and the DS-4 instruments. Let's skip over the V.C.F for just a moment, just because the V.C.A can be set up to affect the V.C.F. So the V.C.A, or voltage-controlled amplifier, primarily controls the shape of the volume envelope. The V.C.A has 2 modes, gate and envelope. When it's set to gate, the synth behaves like an organ, note on and note off. But when it's set to envelope, these 4 sliders control the 4 stages of the volume envelope: attack, decay, sustain, and release. Here's a graphic to show how volume is affected over time. Attack sets the speed of the onset of the note. The shorter the attack, the more immediate the start of the note. And vice versa, when the attack is set to slow, the start of the note comes on slowly. Decay is the next stage, and this slider determines how fast or slow the volume drops to the sustain level after the attack stage is completed. If the sustain level is set high, you won't hear the volume drop down, and you won't hear the decay stage. So to demonstrate, I'll lower the sustain halfway, and I'll keep the attack at a medium level, so you can hear the attack and then the decay clearly. The sustain stage sets the volume where the note settles after the attack and decay stages are complete. Once you reach the sustain stage, the volume will remain there for as long as you hold the note. And finally, the release slider controls how long the note remains after you've released the key. So if it's set to short, the note immediately turns off when you let go of the key. Whereas if you lengthen the release, you'll hear the tail remain after you've released the key. The volume envelope will re-trigger every time you hit a key when you're in poly or mono modes, whether you have overlapping notes or not. But when you're in legato mode, only the first note will trip the envelope. If there are overlapping notes, the envelope will not re-trigger until you've let off all the notes, and then it will reset for the first note you hit out in the open. With the voltage-controlled filter, let's start with the filter type. Right below the cutoff knob is a pull-down menu that determines what type of filter we're using. Let's just use the default low-pass filter to start. A low-pass filter acts like a sort of extreme equalizer, where all frequencies above a certain point are filtered out, and everything below that point passes through, hence the term low pass, because low frequencies are allowed to pass through without being filtered. We refer to that point as the cutoff frequency. As we sweep the cutoff knob up and down, we can hear the filter opening up and closing down, creating a tone shift similar to a wah-wah pedal. The resonance knob increases the volume right at the cutoff point, creating what's called a resonance peak. As you sweep the cutoff knob, you can hear that resonance peak really jutting out, exaggerating the effect. And if you push the resonance to an extreme, the filter can actually start to self-oscillate, creating a really focused tone at that frequency. There are several other types of filters in the pull-down menu. There are a few different low-pass filters, each with their own unique shape and character. There are a few different high-pass filters, which filter out low frequencies and let high frequencies pass through, sort of an inverse of the low-pass filter. There's a band-pass filter that lets only a specific frequency band through, and a notch filter that leaves all frequencies intact except for a specific frequency band. In addition, there's a phaser effect that creates a unique comb filtering tone shift. And there are two vowel and two formant filters. The vowel and formant filters are a combination of filters that are meant to sound like the different vowels and formants of human speech. Now that you can see generally how a filter works, let's look at the envelope amount knob, which is what connects the ADSR sliders from the V.C.A to the cutoff knob in the filter module. The basic idea is that the shape of the ADSR envelope will automatically move the cutoff knob as you hit a key, kind of the way an auto wah pedal works. This envelope amount knob is bipolar, which means the zero value is in the middle, where it has no effect, and it sweeps from negative to positive. Let's just move the knob in the positive direction first to demonstrate how this works. And we'll leave the V.C.A in gate mode so that the volume is note on, note off. This way we're only listening to the effect of the ADSR envelope on the filter for now. So the cutoff frequency follows the ADSR envelope in the V.C.A module and shapes the tone of the note over time. With these settings, the envelope is shaped like this. And that means that the envelope sweeps up during the attack phase, driving the cutoff up and opening the filter. Then it sweeps down during the decay phase, decreasing the cutoff and closing down the filter, and then settling at the sustain level. Since we're in gate mode on the V.C.A, we won't hear how the release phase closes down the cutoff frequency, but we'll look at that in a minute when we switch to envelope mode. So here's what this setting sounds like. Now if we shorten the attack, the cutoff will start off high and jump right into the decay phase, so it'll start ducking the cutoff down to the sustain level. Here's what that sounds like. Now if we lengthen the attack and raise up the sustain, essentially eliminating the decay phase, we'll hear the cutoff sweep open and remain open, following the shape of the ADSR envelope. The cutoff knob just sets the starting point of the sweep. So if I lower the cutoff, the sweep will start at a lower frequency, but the sweep will work the same way. And likewise, if I raise the cutoff, the sweep starts up higher, but the shape of the sweep remains the same. The envelope amount knob essentially sets the amount that the ADSR envelope affects the cutoff sweep. So if I crank up the envelope amount, the sweep is much more drastic. And as I bring it closer to zero, it becomes more subtle. Again, this envelope amount knob is bipolar, so when it's set to 12 o'clock, the ADSR envelope has no effect, and therefore there is no automatic filter sweep. But when you turn the knob to the left, in the negative direction, the auto filter sweep is inverted. So instead of opening the filter or raising the cutoff in the attack phase, it's now closing the filter down. And instead of the filter closing back down during the decay phase, or lowering the cutoff, the filter is now opening back up, or raising the cutoff, and then settling at the sustain level. Now since we have the V.C.A in gate mode, we can't hear what happens during the release phase with the filter cutoff. Now that the V.C.A is switched to envelope mode, you can hear that the ADSR controls are affecting both the filter cutoff and the volume. So with the longer release time, you can hear the note ring on, and you can hear that the filter closes down as the note fades to silence. And conversely, when the envelope amount knob is set to a negative value, the cutoff frequency increases as the note releases. The final thing to emphasize about the V.C.A's ADSR controls is that just like the way they control volume in poly and mono modes, the envelope is re-triggered every time you hit a new note. But in legato mode, only the first note triggers the envelope. Any overlapping notes will not re-trigger the envelope. Let's turn off the V.C.F and set the V.C.A to gate so that we just have a very basic, unfiltered tone with note on, note off behavior to demonstrate clearly what the arpeggiator does. At these settings, if we play just one note, you hear 16th notes being played as a pulse repeatedly. But if I play a simple triad by adding the 3rd and the 5th interval, we see that the arpeggiator plays those notes in a sequence of pulses. The rate pull-down menu changes the speed of the playback in relation to the tempo of the session you're in, ranging from quarter notes to 30-second triplets. And the pattern can be selected in this pull-down menu. By default, we have it set to played, meaning the pattern is repeated in the order that you struck the keys. So if I play the 1st, 3rd, then 5th, we hear the pattern in that order. If I reverse it and play the 5th, 3rd, and 1st, you hear the pattern playing downward. And if I play 1st, 5th, 3rd, then octave, you hear the pattern play in that order. If we switch the pattern to up, the notes will always arpeggiate in order from the lowest to the highest, no matter what order I play them in. Down sets the order downward. The up and down setting always plays the depressed notes cascading up, then down. Down and up inversely, and random simply randomizes the order. The chord setting only works as it should when the instrument is set to poly mode. It ends up playing all notes in pulses simultaneously. If you have it in mono or legato mode, it will only pulse the latest note over and over again. If you move the octave knob to +1, it will arpeggiate the pattern across the octave you're in and the octave above it. Moving it to +2 plays the pattern in the octave you're in, +2 octaves. The range extends up to 3 octaves above and 3 octaves below. The effects section is almost identical to the effects section in the Syndrum and the DS-4. There are 3 effects: distortion, delay, and reverb. The knob sets the amount and the pull-down menu sets the type. There are 3 types of distortion: crush, which is a bit crusher, crunch, which is a guitar pedal type of distortion, and tape, which is a tape saturation emulation. The delay syncs to your session's tempo and has settings ranging from whole note all the way up to 256th notes, with dotted and triplet options in between. The reverb has the same 4 original impulse responses that are included in the Syndrum and DS-4 effects sections: room, hall, plate, and spring. Within the folder of each instrument, the contact resource file, NKR, the contact cache file, and the samples folder contain all of the samples, graphics, scripts, and impulse responses for the instruments. But all you need to access is the instruments folder, which contains the default instrument, this NKI file, and the presets folder. So if you just want to quickly open the instrument, you can open the default. But there are a number of carefully crafted presets that Iconic Instruments has made to help you flip through some very usable sounds and lead you in the right direction for your track. The single folder contains straightforward single-instance instruments. These are all the same as the default instrument, but saved with our customized settings. The multi-folder contains more complicated multi-instruments. Multi-instruments are just 2 or more instances of instruments opened at the same time that are saved as one multi-instrument. In this case, we've saved multiple instances of the Syndrum and DS-4 that are layered over each other to create more complicated instruments. And then finally, there's a blank folder called User that's there for you to save your own instruments. When saving your own instruments, make sure you have the patch-only radio button depressed. If instead you select patch and samples, Contact will save another copy of the samples folder. You already have the samples folder, so you don't need a second copy taking up drive space. Also, make sure the absolute sample paths box is not checked. Otherwise, it will always look for the samples, graphics, etc. in the exact path where you originally saved it. So if you move the instrument to another folder, you'll get an error message when you go to load it. By leaving this box unchecked, Kontakt will search the surrounding file structure and you won't have any errors, no matter where the instruments are located. If you do get that error message, just click the Find Folder button and navigate to where the samples folder is, and it will open properly. Please look out for our upcoming detailed video on Kontakt for guidance on installation, functionality, and other advanced features, like channel routing within your DAW and integrating your external controller. Thanks for checking out Iconic Instruments.